Hello and welcome to the fifth session of my 3D Modeling Principles series. Today we're going to be looking at details, cleanup and topology. So once again, here's the artwork that we're working from. If you do like this artwork, make sure you check out the artist. You can find them on ArtStation, and the artist is Gabe Kralik. Okay, so last time we continued to block out the secondary details of the model. There was a lot of copy and paste involved. We took objects around the structure and we tweaked them a little bit to make them different. We also used the cell fracture quick effect to visualize some cobblestones that we'll manually create later on. So the things we'll be working on today, the goals are that we'll be working on individual sections. So rather than looking at the whole model, we'll just isolate one part and we'll work on that. We'll add final details to the geometry on that area. And we should therefore complete the modeling for the building. The modifiers that we're likely to use will be the subdivision surface modifier, remesh and displacement modifier. And the tools that we're likely to use will be the knife tool, the bevel tool, the loop tool and inset faces. The objectives then today is to rework the assets within the model so that they include any final details that we want to keep in the mesh. We may have other details that get produced through the texturing process, but anything that we want in the mesh we want locked in today. We'll try out 3 levels of fidelity to see what we like for the project. So just on a note for fidelity, any particular level of fidelity that you want for your work is absolutely fine, it's justifiable and it's relevant as 3D artwork, so long as it fits the art style that you're going for. So on the left hand side here we've got a very low poly, very low fidelity style of artwork, and it works absolutely fine so long as everything else in the scene is of that nature. In the middle we've got something that's kind of a kind of hand painted, hand sculpted feel that looks very stylized, doesn't necessarily look realistic, but it's getting closer. And then on the right hand side we have something that looks very realistic, photorealistic textures and surfaces that feel correct for the real world. So whatever you choose to work with, that's up to you. We're going to explore some of the modeling processes of how you would do each of these. But the one thing I would say is just make sure you're not mixing something like example 1 and example 3 within a scene. Okay, let's head on into Blender. Okay, so I'm in Blender and I'm going to start working from simplest art style through to more complex. So we'll start with kind of low poly, ultra stylized, low fidelity sort of feel. So to do that, there's not really much we need to do to these sort of blocks. We could leave them as they are. However, if you don't have any bevels or any kind of differences between the shapes between blocks, they do lose their sense that they're individual bricks. So we just kind of want to separate that out in our shapes. So what I'll do is I'll do this brick in this first style, and then we'll move on to another style with maybe slightly more detail, and we'll kind of go around so we've got 3 or 4 different versions. Okay, so if I start to edit this object here, what I want to do is I want to start seeing where I could add details. So we're always kind of thinking about where details would arrive on a model, and typically it's going to be hard corners getting broken off over time, getting worn down with weather, etc. So the corners are a good place to start. So we could pick individually each corner to add some damage to it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bevel them. You can bevel single vertices. You'll notice that if I try and use the bevel tool, nothing seems to happen. And that's because the bevel tool wants to use 2 vertices together. So if I select 2 of them, it can then make a point to bevel. So the way you get around that is that you can use keyboard shortcuts for it. So if we select this one here, Control B to bevel, and then press V for vertex, then it will allow us to create a bevel from the single vertex. And so we can just go around the model and we can do that. So Control B, V. And then something that I would then do is start to play around with these. So if you select one one of your vertices, you can do GG and slide them so that they change the shape of the bevels that we're creating. If you were to select an edge, for example here, we could then scale these as well. So we could scale them to move them kind of wider or narrower, just to make some slight changes that are inside the mesh. Another thing that you can do, if you turn on, I think it's going to be in one of these here, auto merge in the options settings. We can have auto merge turned on so that when vertices get close enough to each other, they will merge into one. And we can also turn on snapping and have that set to vertex. And the reason why you might want to do that is that, let's say that we don't want everything to have this perfect squared bevel. We could now select this one, grab it, and when it gets close, it's going to snap to that, which is then going to give us a different shape for our actual geometry. Okay, so for this next one, I'm going to use a third-party tool. It's a paid-for plugin called One Click Damage. I think it's worth the money, especially if you're trying to prototype a lot of things very, very quickly. The cost of things change, but it's something like £15, $15, something like that. So I think it's worth the money, because what it does is it adds a lot of this kind of complexity in a completely procedural way. You've got quite a bit of control over how it does it. So I'll show you an example of that. And it's got a little bit more detail than the first version, but you don't end up with geometry that's so high poly that it's going to cause you a problem for game engines, etc. Okay, so to use one-click damage, you essentially click the mesh that you want to add damage to. So I'm going to start with this block here, and I click Make Damage. And so I've got a few options that I can play around with here, and we'll have a look and see what they do. But as you can see, it kind of adds in this kind of edge wear and detail, and there's variation to it. So it's not just straight single verts that are being cut off. It's adding divots and stuff like that. And so that's quite a nice way of being able to produce detail very quickly. There's loads of different versions that you can use within the effect. So we could use the clouds version, which is kind of a bit more gnarly. You also can play with the scale and stuff. So the scale, as you play with it, it almost works a bit like a seed, from what I can understand, because the scale of the actual texture doesn't seem to change, but where it seems to place on the mesh changes. So it doesn't scale in a kind of linear fashion necessarily, but it's good to kind of scrub through and see how it's doing. And the amount is kind of, I think, the intensity. So you can almost think a bit of how much has it worn away. So it can make very small islands of detail, or it can make very large islands and chunky detail. So there's loads of stuff that you could kind of get out of this. We're probably going to scale it down so it's roughly the same amount of wear as this one, but just higher fidelity. Okay, so something like that I think is good. And then we see the actual final result there, and I think that's quite nice. Just so that we can actually have a look at the mesh itself, you'll see it does create very large n-gons, so this won't work for anything that needs to be animated at all without showing a great deal of artifacts. But the actual, the final result itself is really clean. What you end up with is one large n-gon, which doesn't have a ton of geometry, and then just where the detail is, that's where you get this extra geometry. So this brick here, if I turn on statistics, this one brick here in its completed version is 1,000 faces, and you could then use decimate and things like that to kind of cut it down further if you wanted to. What you do find though is if you are using things like shade smooth, because the way it cuts up the normals, you are going to end up with some bad artifacts. So you need to make sure that you're either shading flat, which is going to give you the kind of faceted sections inside the details here, or you're using the shade auto smooth, which will then utilize the settings that you've got for your normals in here regarding auto smooth. Okay, and I like that block there. I think in terms of the efficiency of time, this is absolutely the best method. You get a very fast model, and it's not particularly inefficient in terms of the size of the file and the amount of faces you end up with. Okay, so moving on to the next method. The next method will be looking at the different sculpting tools. Now, we're not going to go really far into this. I'm basically going to highlight this so that if you want to look at sculpting, that may be something you research and dive into. But it's outside of the scope of today to go through how sculpting fully works. But essentially, I'll point something out about the way that sculpting works within Blender. So first things first, we need geometry to be able to sculpt with. So whilst we've got our basic shapes here, I'm actually just going to change my my map cap to this one. It works slightly better for sculpting. I find it's similar to the one that you find in ZBrush. So we need geometry to be able to sculpt. So you'll see that if we have a sculpting tool out and we try to sculpt on these areas, nothing really is going to happen. And the reason for that is because we need a higher poly mesh to actually work to work with it. So in order to do that, you either need to start with a higher poly mesh. I'm just going to start sculpting just this this section itself. You either need to start with a high poly mesh, or you need to do a remesh, which you can do through the sculpting tools. I'm just going to do it through here very quickly. So we'll find remesh, and what this is going to do is it's going to take the mesh that we currently have, and it's going to try and make a higher density version of it. So instead of it being, maybe 30 polygons or whatever we were at that point, it's going to up-res that to maybe a few thousand, so that we can then start to deform it. What you may find is that you need to change the voxel size, etc., or whichever mode you're actually using. You need to tweak these to work to the correct level for you. So if we were to do that and dive into sculpting now, however, it is worth pointing out, if I now go into back into here and I just select this one object and have a look at it on its own, just by adding that bit of detail, this tiny piece is now already at 2000 polys, and it probably needs to go higher. So whenever you build sculpting into your workflow, you're always going to need to do your sculpting, potentially do some retopology. So it's a very quick introduction as to how you would go about that process, but it's one of those things that you would just need to do. You'd have to go round and retopologize basically anything that you create. I'm going to turn off snapping here. Anything that you create in a sculpting workflow will have to be retopologized in order to bake it down so that it's usable. Okay, so let's move on to another method. So one of the things you could do if you wanted a high poly mesh, you could let a lot of the texturing process give you all of those details. So just by having high resolution photographic based or even realistic procedural textures are going to add a lot of details to your mesh. They're going to make it look and feel a lot more realistic. And you could find that actually just by doing this sort of level of detail and then starting to use high-res textures or procedural textures, you end up with something that's extremely realistic. You may also want to do some of these deformations in mesh as well, though. So where would that be relevant? Well, let's say that we've got a large landscape that we're putting together for an interactive scene, so like a game environment, something like that, and we want large sections of the floor to actually have real undulations that aren't just textures and normal maps, bump maps, etc. We want it to actually have real geometry for the kind of for the collisions to kind of move around on, so that the player goes up and down as they move through the map. In that sort of scenario, you'd probably want to use some kind of displacement for the base model. So what we're going to do, we'll just look at this one for now, so that we can see the kind of level of detail that we can add to it. I'm just going to isolate this one. So again, we do need some geometry because we've not got a ton of geometry here. Something this size, I would say that probably the easiest way to get the geometry how you want it is just to put in some edge loops. Okay, so we now have mesh that is fairly equal. If we turn our displacement back on then, and we come into object mode so we can see it, we see we've got some crazy stuff going on. Now that's in part because the strength is really high, so we don't want the strength anywhere near that high whenever we're using this sort of thing. So 0.05, we can still see that it's doing something if we kind of A/B it, so like that. But even that is adding a lot of detail. So what we could do is we could then go into the texture and then start to play around with it. Once you're happy with it, you then have some general changes to your mesh, which, if we were going for a kind of a carved brick effect, then this could show the kind of witness marks, the things that the person who has created it and carved it, the things left by their tools, so that when we apply a realistic texture on top of it, we end up with something that is believable because the actual undulation of the mesh changes. This could be the way that you end up creating larger undulating parts of terrain, and it might be when we later create the ground and the contextual environment for the model that we're working on. It might be that that's how we create the ground that it's all sat on. We'll see when we come to it. Okay, so the process now then is to kind of have a look and see which way you like to work. Would you like to work part by part? Turn off X-ray. Part by part and cut out little sections of the mesh? Would you like to use a plugin that can do some auto damage for you? Would you prefer to go in and do sculpting and go with that workflow, or would you prefer to do something that's a bit more procedural? Once you've decided that, you can then start to add in details all around the model, and it would just be a case of kind of selecting the parts you want to work on, isolating them, and then going in and making those changes, and then popping back out and moving to the next part. And hopefully you'll end up with something that you like, that's moving towards an art direction you want to take this project in. Thank you very much.